My husband promoted his bodyguard to chairman for one night. Then he ordered him to slap me 30 times, just to entertain his mistress. They thought humiliation was power. They thought I would break quietly. But 30 minutes later, everything changed. Because when the truth surfaced, his career collapsed, his fortune vanished, and he was the one begging on his knees. The room was designed to intimidate. High ceilings, dark wood panels, a long table polished to a mirror shine. It was the kind of boardroom meant to make people feel small the moment they walked in. He had chosen it deliberately, not for business, for theater. I remember the way the lights reflected off the glass walls, how the city skyline behind them looked distant and unreal, like a backdrop instead of a place where real lives were happening. The air conditioning was turned too cold, another small cruelty meant to keep everyone on edge. At the head of the table sat my husband, relaxed, almost bored, as if this were just another meeting he needed to get through. Beside him sat his mistress. She didn't belong there, and that was the point. Her presence was a message, a reminder of who he thought had one. She leaned back in her chair, perfectly styled, lips curved in a smile that tried too hard to look casual. Her eyes never left me when I entered the room. I understood immediately. This wasn't about decisions or documents. This was about spectacle. The bodyguard stood near the door. A man I'd seen dozens of times before, silent, professional, always a few steps behind my husband. Today, something about him was different. Tense, uncomfortable. His jaw was set too tight, his hands clenched at his sides. He wouldn't meet my eyes. My husband cleared his throat, enjoying the attention. "Since this is a special occasion," he said, gesturing lazily toward the bodyguard, "I've decided to make a temporary appointment." A few people at the table exchanged confused glances. There were senior executives present, people with decades of experience, people who had built this company brick by brick alongside him. None of them spoke. Silence was safer. For the next hour, my husband continued, "He's the chairman." A laugh rippled through the room. Nervous, obedient, the kind of laughter people offer when they sense danger and want to stay on the right side of it. The mistress laughed the loudest. I stood there, unmoving, my pulse steady in a way that surprised even me. Somewhere deep inside, a switch flipped. The part of me that once tried to appease him went quiet. In its place was something colder, clearer. He turned to the bodyguard. "You have authority," he said. "Use it." The bodyguard swallowed hard. Then my husband looked at me, eyes glittering with something ugly and excited. "I think we need a demonstration," he said. "Don't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He wasn't asking. 30 times, he said lightly, as if discussing numbers on a spreadsheet. Nice and clear. Let everyone see. The room froze. Someone inhaled sharply. Someone else looked down at the table, pretending to study the wood grain. No one spoke. Power has a way of paralyzing even decent people when it's wielded recklessly enough. The bodyguard's face drained of color. "Sir," he said quietly, barely audible, "this isn't." "Chairman," my husband corrected, smiling. "Your decision." That was when I realized something important. This wasn't about me. This was about control. About proving that he could rewrite reality if he wanted to. That titles were toys. That people were props. That consequences were for other men. He believed he was untouchable. The mistress leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, anticipation bright in her eyes. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't conflicted. She was entertained. This was the drama she had been promised. I finally spoke. "Are you finished?" I asked calmly. My voice cut through the room in a way shouting never could. A few heads turned toward me, startled. My husband blinked, surprised, then laughed. "You're in no position to ask questions," he said. "Stand there." I didn't move. The bodyguard looked between us, trapped. He wasn't cruel. He was obedient. And obedience in moments like this becomes its own kind of violence. My husband's smile tightened. "Do it," he said. Time slowed. I became acutely aware of everything. The hum of the lights, the faint traffic noise outside, the shallow breathing of the people around the table. I noticed how calm I felt, how far away fear seemed. That calm wasn't bravery. It was certainty. Certainty that this was the moment everything changed. The bodyguard took one step forward. And in that step, my husband sealed his fate without realizing it. Because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the room wasn't as private as he believed. That power leaves trails. That arrogance creates blind spots. And that some people mistake silence for ignorance. 30 minutes from now, the same man who was enjoying this performance would be begging, not because of what he ordered, but because of who was watching, listening, and recording every second of it. The sound of the first slap didn't echo the way movies make it seem. It was dull, heavy, almost administrative, like a door closing on a room no one planned to enter again. My head turned slightly from the impact, not violently, not dramatically, just enough to register that it had happened. And then there was silence. Not the awkward kind filled with coughs or shifting chairs. This was a deliberate, suffocating silence. The kind that presses in on your ears and makes every breath feel loud. I felt the warmth bloom across my cheek, the sting arriving a half-second later, sharp but contained. I didn't cry out. That was the first thing that unsettled them. The mistress's smile faltered for just a moment. She adjusted in her chair, as if trying to recapture the excitement she'd expected. My husband leaned back, studying my reaction like an experiment. He wanted a display. He wanted chaos. He wanted me to collapse into exactly the role he'd assigned. I stayed still. The bodyguard froze, his hand hovering midair, his breathing uneven. I could see the conflict in his eyes now. He hadn't signed up for this. He was used to threats that stayed hypothetical, power that hid behind contracts and lawyers. This was raw, unavoidable. Continue, my husband said, his voice bored, impatient. We don't have all day. The second slap landed harder. The third harder still. Each one was a punctuation mark in a sentence he thought he was writing. With every strike, the room seemed to shrink, walls inching closer, air growing thinner. Somewhere near the end of the table, someone closed their eyes. I counted silently, not because I needed to, but because it grounded me. 1, 2, 3. Each number anchored me in the present, kept my thoughts from scattering. I focused on breathing evenly, on keeping my posture straight, on refusing to give him what he wanted. The fourth slap, the fifth. By the sixth, murmurs began. Not protests, just discomfort leaking out of people who hadn't expected the spectacle to feel this real. The difference between imagined cruelty and witnessed cruelty is vast. Imagined cruelty feels abstract. Witnessed cruelty stains. The mistress shifted again, crossing her legs, uncrossing them. She laughed once, too loudly, trying to fill the growing unease. Well, she said lightly, she's tougher than I thought. My husband didn't respond. His attention was fixed entirely on me now. His expression had changed, the amusement draining away, replaced by irritation. I wasn't breaking on schedule. Faster, he snapped. The bodyguard's jaw clenched. His hand shook now. The seventh slap landed off rhythm, less controlled. The eighth barely followed. His reluctance was visible, and that irritated my husband even more. Do I need to remind you who signs your checks? He said coldly. That was when something shifted in the room. Not in me, in them. A senior executive near the far end of the table straightened, eyes narrowing. Another glanced at his phone, then at the glass wall behind me, then back at my husband. Someone else swallowed hard, clearly rethinking every decision that had led them to sit silently through this. The ninth slap. The 10th. By now, my cheek throbbed continuously, pain radiating outward in waves. My vision blurred slightly at the edges, but I kept my gaze level, fixed on a spot just past my husband's shoulder. I refused to look at the mistress. She didn't deserve even that acknowledgement. Inside, something unexpected was happening. I wasn't shrinking. I was expanding. Every slap stripped away another layer of fear, another habit of appeasement. What remained was clarity, and clarity, once reached, is immovable. The 11th slap. The 12th. Someone at the table whispered, "This is insane," too softly for my husband to hear, but loud enough for others to notice. Heads nodded, subtle but unmistakable. The spell was breaking. My husband sensed it. He leaned forward now, elbows on the table, eyes sharp. "Keep going," he said louder. "We're almost done. Almost." The bodyguard hesitated before the 13th slap. His hand lingered in the air, trembling. He looked at me, then really looked at me, and I saw something close to apology in his eyes. I gave him the smallest nod, not of permission, of understanding. That nod haunted him later. I know it did. The slap landed. The mistress stopped smiling altogether. By the 15th, the room was no longer complicit. It was trapped. No one knew how to stop what was happening without becoming a target themselves. This is how power sustains itself, by convincing everyone that silence is safer than resistance. But silence is never neutral. The 16th slap cracked through the air, louder than the rest. The bodyguard's restraint was slipping, not toward violence, but toward collapse. Sweat dotted his forehead. His breathing was ragged. My husband stood abruptly. "Enough of the theatrics," he said. "Finish it." The command rang out like a verdict. I tasted blood, and still I did not fall, because by then I knew something he didn't. This room was no longer his stage. It was his evidence. The sound of the first slap didn't echo the way movies make it seem. It was dull, heavy, almost administrative, like a door closing on a room no one planned to enter again. My head turned slightly from the impact, not violently, not dramatically, just enough to register that it had happened. And then there was silence. Not the awkward kind filled with coughs or shifting chairs. This was a deliberate, suffocating silence. The kind that presses in on your ears and makes every breath feel loud. I felt the warmth bloom across my cheek, the sting arriving a half-second later, sharp but contained. I didn't cry out. That was the first thing that unsettled them. The mistress's smile faltered for just a moment. She adjusted in her chair, as if trying to recapture the excitement she'd expected. My husband leaned back, studying my reaction like an experiment. He wanted a display. He wanted chaos. He wanted me to collapse into exactly the role he'd assigned. I stayed still. The bodyguard froze, his hand hovering midair, his breathing uneven. I could see the conflict in his eyes now. He hadn't signed up for this. He was used to threats that stayed hypothetical, power that hid behind contracts and lawyers. This was raw, unavoidable. "Continue," my husband said, his voice bored impatient. "We don't have all day." The second slap landed harder. The third harder still. Each one was a punctuation mark in a sentence he thought he was writing. With every strike, the room seemed to shrink, walls inching closer, air growing thinner. Somewhere near the end of the table, someone closed their eyes. I counted silently, not because I needed to, but because it grounded me. 1, 2, 3. Each number anchored me in the present, kept my thoughts from scattering. I focused on breathing evenly, on keeping my posture straight, on refusing to give him what he wanted. The fourth slap, the fifth. By the sixth, murmurs began. Not protests, just discomfort leaking out of people who hadn't expected the spectacle to feel this real. The difference between imagined cruelty and witnessed cruelty is vast. Imagined cruelty feels abstract. Witnessed cruelty stains. The mistress shifted again, crossing her legs, uncrossing them. She laughed once, too loudly, trying to fill the growing unease. "Well," she said lightly, "she's tougher than I thought." My husband didn't respond. His attention was fixed entirely on me now. His expression had changed, the amusement draining away, replaced by irritation. I wasn't breaking on schedule. "Faster," he snapped. The bodyguard's jaw clenched. His hand shook now. The seventh slap landed off rhythm, less controlled. The eighth barely followed. His reluctance was visible, and that irritated my husband even more. "Do I need to remind you who signs your checks?" he said coldly. That was when something shifted in the room. Not in me, in them. A senior executive near the far end of the table straightened, eyes narrowing. Another glanced at his phone, then at the glass wall behind me, then back at my husband. Someone else swallowed hard, clearly rethinking every decision that had led them to sit silently through this. The ninth slap, the 10th. By now, my cheek throbbed continuously, pain radiating outward in waves. My vision blurred slightly at the edges, but I kept my gaze level, fixed on a spot just past my husband's shoulder. I refused to look at the mistress. She didn't deserve even that acknowledgement. Inside, something unexpected was happening. I wasn't shrinking. I was expanding. Every slap stripped away another layer of fear, another habit of appeasement. What remained was clarity. And clarity, once reached, is immovable. The 11th slap. The 12th. Someone at the table whispered, "This is insane," too softly for my husband to hear, but loud enough for others to notice. Heads nodded, subtle but unmistakable. The spell was breaking. My husband sensed it. He leaned forward now, elbows on the table, eyes sharp. "Keep going," he said louder. "We're almost done." Almost. The bodyguard hesitated before the 13th slap. His hand lingered in the air, trembling. He looked at me, then really looked at me, and I saw something close to apology in his eyes. I gave him the smallest nod. Not of permission, of understanding. That nod haunted him later. I know it did. The slap landed. The mistress stopped smiling altogether. By the 15th, the room was no longer complicit. It was trapped. No one knew how to stop what was happening without becoming a target themselves. This is how power sustains itself, by convincing everyone that silence is safer than resistance. But silence is never neutral. The 16th slap cracked through the air, louder than the rest. The bodyguard's restraint was slipping, not toward violence, but toward collapse. Sweat dotted his forehead. His breathing was ragged. My husband stood abruptly. "Enough of the theatrics," he said. "Finish it." The command rang out like a verdict. I tasted blood, and still I did not fall, because by then I knew something he didn't. This room was no longer his stage. It was his evidence. By the time the 20th slap landed, the room no longer belonged to him. That was the strange thing about power. It feels absolute right up until the moment it isn't. There was no announcement, no dramatic reversal, just a subtle reordering of attention. People stopped watching me and started watching him. The bodyguard hand dropped to his side, not because he was finished, but because something inside him had finally refused. His shoulders sagged, as if the weight of what he was being forced to do had settled all at once. "I can't," he said hoarsely. The words hit harder than any slap. My husband turned slowly, disbelief etched across his face. "What did you say?" "I said I can't," the bodyguard repeated, louder this time. "This isn't authority. This is abuse." By the time the 20th slap landed, the room no longer belonged to him. That was the strange thing about power. It feels absolute right up until the moment it isn't. There was no announcement, no dramatic reversal, just a subtle reordering of attention. People stopped watching me and started watching him. The bodyguard's hand dropped to his side, not because he was finished, but because something inside him had finally refused. His shoulders sagged, as if the weight of what he was being forced to do had settled all at once. "I can't," he said hoarsely. The words hit harder than any slap. My husband turned slowly, disbelief etched across his face. "What did you say?" "I said I can't," the bodyguard repeated, louder this time. "This isn't authority. This is abuse." The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For a split second, no one moved. The mistress stared at the bodyguard as if he'd broken an unspoken contract. The executives at the table exchanged looks that finally crossed the line from discomfort into decision. My husband laughed, sharp and incredulous. "You're done when I say you're done," he snapped. "Sit down before you ruin your career." That was when someone else spoke. Actually, a voice said from the far end of the table, calm but unmistakably firm, "I think this meeting is over." It was one of the board members, one he had underestimated for years. Quiet, methodical, the kind of man who took notes while others postured. My husband's head snapped toward him. "You don't get to decide that." The board member met his gaze evenly. "I do when criminal behavior is occurring in a company facility." The word criminal landed like a crack in glass. Another executive stood, then another. Chairs scraped softly against the floor, not in protest, in separation. People physically creating distance from him, from the act, from the liability. The mistress's face drained of color. "What are you doing?" she hissed, looking around. "Sit down." "He's joking." No one listened. The bodyguard stepped back, putting physical space between himself and my husband. His voice shook, but he didn't back down. I won't touch her again. And I won't lie about what happened here. That was the moment my husband finally looked uncertain. He opened his mouth to speak, but another interruption cut him off, this one digital. A soft chime echoed through the room as someone's phone connected automatically to the large screen at the end of the table. The screen lit up. Live footage. The room. This room. From multiple angles. Someone had activated the recording system integrated into the boardroom for security and compliance. The system he'd insisted on installing years ago to monitor others. The same system he'd forgotten about when he decided this room was his playground. My husband stared at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. "No," he said quietly. The mistress stood abruptly. "Turn that off." No one moved. The footage was crystal clear. His voice, his orders, the slaps, the laughter, the silence. Everything preserved in high definition, time-stamped, undeniable. One of the executives spoke again. "This footage is automatically backed up off-site," he said, "and compliance has already been alerted." My husband's face went gray. "This isn't happening," he muttered. "This is a misunderstanding." I finally moved. Not away. Forward. Each step felt deliberate, controlled. I stood straighter than I had when I entered the room, pain pulsing but contained. When I spoke, my voice was steady. "You wanted a demonstration," I said. "You got one." He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Not as someone he could control. Not as an accessory to humiliate. As a variable he had failed to account for. "This ends now," he said too quickly. "Everyone calm down. We can talk about this." But no one wanted to talk anymore. They wanted distance. Phones came out, not to record, I noticed that too late, but to document. Messages sent. Lawyers contacted. A chain reaction already in motion. The mistress tried to grab his arm. "Say something," she whispered urgently. "Fix this." He shook her off. In that moment, she stopped being entertained. She became expendable. Security arrived at the door, responding to an automated alert. Two men in suits, expressions neutral but alert. They took in the scene in seconds. The standing executives, the frozen screen, my bruised face. "Sir," one of them said to my husband, "we need you to step away from the table." He didn't move. "I own this place," he said weakly. "Not right now," the other replied. That was when it happened. The shift from authority to isolation. People stopped looking at him altogether. Their attention moved to each other, to logistics, to consequences. He was no longer the center. He was the problem. The mistress backed away slowly, as if physical distance might shield her from the fallout. Her earlier confidence evaporated, replaced by calculation. She was already planning her exit. I could see it. My husband looked around, searching for allies. He found none. 30 minutes earlier, he had believed he could order humiliation like a performance. Now, the room was quietly dismantling him, and the collapse had only just begun. The next 30 minutes didn't unfold loudly. There were no shouts, no dramatic accusations, no cinematic confrontations. Power doesn't usually collapse in a single explosion. It dissolves, quietly, methodically, in full view of everyone who once benefited from it. My husband was escorted to a chair near the wall, not restrained, not threatened, just removed from the center. That small relocation did more damage to him than any raised voice could have. He kept trying to stand, to reinsert himself into conversations that no longer included him. Each time, someone gently but firmly asked him to sit back down. "Please don't make this worse," one executive murmured, not unkindly. Worse. The word landed hard. He had spent years believing there was no worse for men like him. That consequences were theoretical, negotiable, something that happened to other people. Now he watched as his world recalibrated without his consent. Legal counsel was called. Not his. The company's. Compliance officers arrived next, moving with a calm efficiency that spoke of protocols long prepared but rarely used. They didn't look at me with pity. They looked at the room, at the screen, at the people involved. They were assessing risk, liability, exposure. And my husband was suddenly the largest one present. The mistress tried to speak again, her voice sharp with panic. "I was invited," she insisted, to no one in particular. "I didn't do anything." No one responded. Her relevance had expired the moment the spectacle stopped being entertaining and started being dangerous. She hovered near the door, unsure whether to leave or stay, clearly terrified of choosing wrong. I remained standing. Someone offered me a chair. I declined, not out of pride, out of clarity. Sitting felt like surrendering space I had already reclaimed. An executive approached me quietly, holding a tablet. "We have everything," he said. "The footage, the audio, the timestamps. Are you okay?" It was the first time anyone had asked me that question. "I will be," I answered honestly. He nodded once, respectfully, and stepped away. Across the room, my husband finally realized something fundamental had shifted. He wasn't being punished yet. That would come later. What was happening now was worse. He was being assessed, stripped of narrative, reduced to facts. He stood abruptly, ignoring the protests this time. "This is outrageous," he snapped. "You're all overreacting. This was a private matter." One of the lawyers looked up slowly. "There is no such thing as a private matter when abuse occurs on company property, involving company personnel, using company authority." Abuse. The word again. It followed him now, unavoidable. "You can't do this," he said, his voice cracking just slightly. "I built this company. And that," the lawyer replied calmly, "is what makes this especially serious." I watched his face change then. Not anger, not arrogance, fear. He turned to me, desperation creeping into his eyes. "Say something," he pleaded quietly. "Tell them this isn't what it looks like." I met his gaze evenly. "This is exactly what it looks like," I said. The mistress gasped softly, as if she'd been slapped herself. "You don't have to destroy him," she said, her voice trembling. "This went too far, but—" "Too far," someone interrupted sharply. "This went criminal." She fell silent. Security informed my husband he needed to leave the building. Immediately, not as a courtesy, as a requirement. His access badge was deactivated in real time. I watched him swipe it instinctively at the door once, twice, before realizing it no longer worked. That small beep of denial echoed louder than anything else in the room. He turned back, face pale. "You can't lock me out of my own company." A compliance officer answered without emotion. "You are not authorized to be here at this time." The word authorized hit him like a blow. As he was escorted toward the exit, he looked back at me again, not with rage this time, with something close to disbelief, as if he couldn't understand how the script had changed without his permission. "This doesn't end here," he said weakly. I didn't respond, because it already had. The doors closed behind him with a soft, final sound. The room exhaled. People began speaking in low voices, coordinating next steps, discussing statements, procedures, responsibilities. No one asked whether he would recover from this. They were already planning around his absence. Someone finally approached the mistress and asked her to leave. She didn't argue. She gathered her things with shaking hands and slipped out the same door, no longer glamorous, no longer protected. When the room was almost empty, one of the board members approached me again. "We will support whatever action you choose to take," he said. "Legally, professionally." I nodded. "Thank you." As I walked out of that room, bruised but upright, I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph, not revenge. Justice doesn't always feel loud. Sometimes it feels like gravity finally reasserting itself. 30 minutes earlier, he had believed he could humiliate me for entertainment. 30 minutes later, everything he had built was already collapsing under the weight of his own choices. And this time, no amount of begging would stop it. He found me in the hallway outside the boardroom. Not immediately, not dramatically. At first, he paced the corridor like a trapped animal, running his hands through his hair, muttering into his phone as call after call went unanswered. He tried his lawyer, his assistant, 2 board members who had once owed him favors. No one picked up. That was when he saw me. I was standing near the window at the end of the hall, waiting for the elevator, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. My face was swollen now, the bruises no longer subtle. I didn't try to hide them. I didn't need to. They spoke clearly enough. He approached slowly, cautiously, like someone nearing something that might explode. "Please," he said, his voice low and strained. "We need to talk." I didn't turn around. "I know this looks bad," he continued, words tumbling over each other now. But we can fix it. I can fix it. I'll make it right. Just say something. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. I faced him then. Up close, he looked smaller. Not physically, but energetically. The certainty that had once filled every room with him was gone, replaced by panic that leaked out through every gesture. His hand shook slightly. His eyes darted past me, checking to see who might be watching. You ordered someone to hit me 30 times, I said evenly. In front of witnesses. On company property. Recorded. He swallowed. I didn't think. That's correct, I said. You didn't. He reached for my arm, then stopped himself, remembering too late that touching me now would only make things worse. I was angry, he said. I lost control. It won't happen again. I tilted my head slightly. That's not an apology. That's a justification. His breath hitched. I'm sorry, he said quickly. I'm sorry. Just help me. Please. I'll do anything. Anything. The word echoed in the space between us, heavy with irony. Behind him, the elevator chimed softly, doors sliding open. I didn't step inside. Not yet. I wanted him to understand something first. You already did everything, I said. You just did it to the wrong person. His eyes widened, confusion breaking through the fear. What does that mean? It means, I said calmly, that you used your power in a way that made it impossible for anyone to protect you afterward. He shook his head, frantic now. They can't take everything from me. This is my company. My name is on the building. Names don't protect people, I replied. Records do. He stared at me, realization dawning slowly. You planned this. I almost laughed. No, I said. You did. He took a step back, as if the floor had shifted beneath him. You're enjoying this, he accused weakly. I met his gaze steadily. I'm surviving it. That was when he dropped. Not dramatically. Not all the way to his knees like in movies. Just enough to lose his balance. One hand bracing against the wall, posture collapsing inward. The man who had once commanded rooms now looked like someone begging for permission to exist. I'll give you everything, he whispered. Money, shares, whatever you want. Just tell them to stop. I felt nothing hearing that. No thrill, no satisfaction, just confirmation. This isn't about what I want, I said. It's about what you did. The elevator chimed again, impatient now. I stepped inside this time. As the doors began to close, he lunged forward, desperation overriding dignity. Please, he said one last time. I can't lose everything. The door slid shut, cutting him off mid-sentence. As the elevator descended, I leaned back against the wall, my body finally shaking now that it was over. Not from fear, from release, from the sudden absence of pressure I had lived under for far too long. Downstairs, the lobby buzzed with quiet activity. Lawyers, security, staff moving carefully, aware that something significant had happened upstairs, even if they didn't yet know all the details. I walked past them without explanation. Outside, the air felt different, lighter. I took a deep breath, wincing slightly as my ribs protested, and let it out slowly. Behind me, in that building, his career was unraveling minute by minute. Calls would come, statements would be drafted, boards would meet, decisions would be made without him. And somewhere inside, he would finally understand the cost of believing humiliation was power. I didn't look back, because when someone shows you exactly who they are, the only winning move is to leave them with the consequences. The fallout didn't take days. It took hours. By the time I reached home, my phone was already vibrating with notifications I didn't open. News outlets moved faster than people realize when evidence is undeniable and names are recognizable. Internal memos leaked. Footage circulated in closed legal channels. Statements were drafted, revised, then scrapped entirely as lawyers realized there was no version of the story that made him look anything but dangerous. I sat on the edge of my bed and finally allowed myself to feel the ache in my body. My cheek pulsed with a steady heat. My jaw felt tight, sore from impact and restraint. I pressed a cold pack against my face and breathed slowly, grounding myself in the quiet of my own space. Across the city, he was spiraling. His lawyer finally returned his calls, but the tone had changed. It was no longer about defense. It was about damage control. Resignations were suggested. Silence was advised. Every word was chosen carefully, not to protect him, but to shield everyone else connected to him. The board convened an emergency session without him. That fact alone would have shattered him if he'd been thinking clearly. For years, meetings didn't happen unless he was present. Now decisions were being made specifically to exclude him. His authority wasn't just questioned, it was suspended, then stripped. The mistress tried to distance herself immediately. Statements about being unaware and deeply disturbed surfaced through intermediaries. She scrubbed her social media within hours. Photos disappeared. Connections were severed. She had mistaken proximity to power for protection. When the power collapsed, she was left exposed. He tried to reach me again, this time through an intermediary, a mutual acquaintance who used to call me family. The message was brief and carefully worded. He wanted to apologize properly. He wanted a chance to explain. He wanted to know what it would take to make this go away. I didn't respond, because there are moments when response itself becomes a form of permission. By the next morning, his name was already absent from the company website. Not removed entirely, just relocated. A subtle shift from present leadership to past affiliation. That small edit spoke volumes. It told investors everything they needed to know without saying a word. Stock values dipped. Partners asked questions. Sponsors paused. And the narrative he had spent years controlling slipped completely out of his hands. I watched none of it unfold directly. I didn't refresh news pages or monitor updates. I focused on myself, on ice packs and medication and rest, on the simple act of reclaiming my body from shock. That choice mattered, because while his world was imploding publicly, mine was stabilizing privately. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was responding slowly, deliberately on my terms. That afternoon, my lawyer called. Calm, efficient, prepared. She confirmed what I already knew. Everything had been documented thoroughly. The company was cooperating fully. There would be no attempts to discredit me. Too many witnesses. Too much evidence. Too much liability. You're protected, she said, and you're believed. Those words landed deeper than anything else that day. Belief is not just emotional validation. It's structural safety. It's systems aligning around truth instead of power. By evening, he was officially suspended from all executive duties pending investigation. His access to accounts frozen. His signature authority revoked. The empire he'd treated like a toy was now locked behind protocols he couldn't bypass. And for the first time since I'd known him, he was irrelevant to the process. That night, I slept deeply. Not because the pain was gone, but because the danger was. The call came just after midnight. Not from him directly. He had learned, finally, that I would not answer. It came from an unfamiliar number, one I almost ignored until intuition nudged me otherwise. When I picked up, there was a pause on the other end, the sound of shallow breathing, and then a voice I recognized immediately. It was his father. We had never been close. Cordial, polite, distant. He had always admired his son's ambition, his dominance, the way he took charge. I used to think that admiration was harmless. Now I understood where my husband had learned that power meant never being questioned. I'm calling, his father said slowly, carefully, because things are very bad. I didn't respond. Silence had become my most effective language. He's losing everything, he continued, voice tight. The board, the partners, the accounts. They're talking about criminal exposure. He's not thinking clearly. Still, I said nothing. There was a long exhale on the other end of the line. He's scared, his father admitted. I've never seen him like this. That was the moment something crystallized for me. Fear had never stopped my husband before. Fear of losing me hadn't. Fear of crossing lines hadn't. Fear of consequences hadn't. The only fear that reached him now was the loss of status, of identity, of the illusion of invincibility. I'm not the person to help him with that, I said finally. His father hesitated. I know what he did was unforgivable, he said. But you have to understand. No, I interrupted gently. I don't. The word landed heavier than anger ever could. I don't have to understand why someone chose to humiliate me for entertainment, I continued. I don't have to understand why power mattered more than decency. And I don't have to understand why everyone stayed silent until it became inconvenient. There was nothing he could say to that. I'm asking you, his father tried again, voice cracking now, as family. That ended the moment he ordered someone to hurt me. I replied. And you know it. The line was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller. What do you want? I almost smiled. I want nothing, I said. That's the point. After the call ended, I sat in the dark for a while, phone resting in my lap. I felt no triumph, no guilt, just a calm certainty that I had finally stopped carrying weight that was never mine. Across the city, my husband was unraveling. He spent that night pacing an apartment that no longer felt like his. He replayed the boardroom scene again and again, searching for the moment it slipped away from him. He told himself it had been a joke that went too far, that people were overreacting, that he could still salvage this with the right words. But words were useless now. By morning, formal notices arrived. Investigations, reviews, suspensions pending outcome. Each document stripped another layer of authority away. The man who once signed off on others' futures was now waiting for his own to be decided by committees that would never invite him into the room. He tried to rage against it at first, accused betrayal, threatened lawsuits, promised retaliation. None of it landed. Power only works when others believe in it. His belief was no longer enough. The mistress vanished entirely. Phones disconnected. Messages unanswered. She had already rewritten her story, recasting herself as an outsider who had misjudged a man. Survival makes cowards efficient. Alone now, truly alone, he finally did what he should have done from the beginning. He reflected, and that reflection was brutal. He saw himself clearly for the first time, not as a leader, not as a provider, not as a man in control, but as someone who had mistaken fear for respect and humiliation for authority. He saw the faces in that boardroom again, not impressed, not intimidated, but appalled. He saw my face most clearly of all, not broken, not pleading, unmoved. That image followed him everywhere. For me, life continued in quieter ways. I attended appointments. I spoke with lawyers. I took slow walks, feeling my strength return. Each day, the bruises faded a little more. Each day, the distance between who I had been and who I was becoming grew wider. I wasn't rebuilding out of anger. I was rebuilding out of clarity. And clarity doesn't negotiate with the past. The first door that closed was the easiest to ignore. It was a polite email, carefully worded, sent by someone who had once greeted him with enthusiasm and familiarity. It thanked him for his years of leadership, expressed concern over recent events, and explained that his presence at upcoming functions would no longer be appropriate. No accusations, no anger, just distance. He reread it several times, searching for a loophole, a phrase he could challenge. There was none. It was final in the way only professionally curated disappointment can be. The second door closed louder. His bank account flagged unusual activity, not because of fraud, but because access had been restricted. Large transfers required secondary authorization now. Credit lines were paused pending review. It wasn't punishment. It was risk management. He was no longer considered stable. By the third door, panic set in. He arrived at a private club he belonged to for years, a place where his name had once meant deference and discretion. The valet didn't recognize him at first. When he did, his smile was strained. "I'm sorry," the man said quietly. "I need to check something." That check took too long. When a manager finally appeared, the tone was unmistakable. Concerned, apologetic, firm. Memberships were under review. Until further notice, it would be best if he didn't use the facilities. He stood there, stunned, the reality finally sinking in. This wasn't one incident. This was a pattern cascading outward. People weren't waiting to see how things turned out. They were deciding how far away they needed to be. Reputation isn't lost when guilt is proven. It's lost when association becomes dangerous. He drove aimlessly for hours that day, phone resting on the passenger seat like an accusation. He wanted to call someone, anyone, who would tell him this was temporary, that would blow over, that he was still who he thought he was. No one did. Meanwhile, My life continued to narrow in focus and widen in possibility. I attended a meeting with my lawyer that afternoon, calm and prepared. We discussed options without urgency, civil paths, protective measures, timelines. Each choice was mine. That mattered. She slid a document across the table, her expression neutral but intent. You should be aware, she said, that several executives have offered sworn statements. Voluntarily. I absorbed that quietly. They weren't doing it for me. They were doing it for themselves. That was fine. Truth doesn't care about motivation. It just needs witnesses. Later, alone again, I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. The bruises were still there, yellowing at the edges now, but my eyes were different, steadier, clear. I looked like someone who had crossed a line and refused to step back. That evening, another door closed for him, the one he had always assumed was permanent. His father called again. This time, there was no attempt at negotiation, just exhaustion. They've asked me to step in, his father said quietly, to handle things, to limit damage. He waited for reassurance, for loyalty, for rescue. It didn't come. I won't defend what you did, his father continued, and I won't ask her to protect you. The silence that followed was heavy. I thought you were stronger than this, his father added. I was wrong. That was the moment my husband finally understood the scope of what he'd lost. Not money, not titles. Belief. Once belief is gone, power has nothing to stand on. He tried to sleep that night and couldn't. Every room felt unfamiliar now, stripped of the comfort that had come from knowing he could bend situations to his will. He replayed the boardroom scene again, but now the focus had shifted. He didn't see himself issuing orders. He saw the faces that had turned away, the bodyguard's refusal, the executive's voice, the screen lighting up, and me, standing there, silent and unyielding. He realized then that I had never needed to raise my voice or strike back. The system he thought he controlled had done the work for me the moment he exposed himself within it. The next morning, a headline appeared in a financial publication, carefully phrased. No names in the title, but enough detail for anyone in his world to know exactly who it referred to. Investors reacted immediately. Partners distanced themselves further. Calls stopped coming altogether. For me, that day passed quietly. I met a friend for coffee, sat in the sun, talked about ordinary things. For the first time in a long while, my life felt proportionate again. No extremes, no bracing, just presence. Power had left him not with a bang, but with a series of closed doors he could no longer force open. And I had walked away before any of them slammed shut behind me. The quiet arrived the way storms sometimes do after devastation, sudden, heavy, and disorienting. For years, my life had been shaped around his volatility, his schedules, his demands, the constant calibration required to avoid triggering his temper. Now that everything had collapsed, there was nothing to react to, no fires to put out, no moods to manage, just silence. At first, that silence felt unreal. I would wake in the morning expecting messages, calls, some new emergency demanding my attention. There were none. The absence was not relief yet. It was unfamiliar territory. My nervous system, trained for vigilance, took time to believe that the danger had passed. I began to notice how my body responded to peace. My shoulders dropped without effort. My breathing slowed. I stopped clenching my jaw. These changes were subtle, but they accumulated, each one a quiet rebellion against the life I had lived before. Across the city, his quiet was very different. It was filled with unanswered emails, unopened doors, and the low hum of consequences that never fully went away. He spent his days meeting with lawyers who spoke in careful, clinical terms, explaining realities he could not negotiate with. They didn't flatter him. They didn't fear him. They didn't rush to fix things. They outlined losses, positions vacated, shares diluted, influence reduced to memories and footnotes. Each meeting ended the same way, with fewer options than the one before it. He tried to reassert control in small ways, sending messages that framed him as the victim, suggesting he had been provoked, implying misunderstandings. None of it landed. The story was already written, and it wasn't his anymore. For the first time, he experienced what it meant to be unheard. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding in ways that felt almost boring in their normalcy. I organized my space. I sorted through old documents and discarded anything that tied me unnecessarily to him. I donated clothes I associated with events where I had felt small. I kept only what felt honest. Each small act was a reclamation. Friends noticed the change before I did. They told me my voice sounded different, calmer, more grounded. I laughed more easily. I listened without tension. I stopped apologizing for taking up space in conversations. One afternoon, as I walked slowly through a park, still mindful of my healing body, I realized something startling. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had fueled me through the immediate aftermath. It had given me momentum when shock threatened to paralyze me. But now, anger had burned itself out, leaving clarity behind. I didn't need to punish him in my thoughts. Reality was doing that efficiently enough. I thought back to the boardroom, to the moment he ordered those slaps, believing humiliation equaled dominance. The memory no longer made my chest tighten. It felt distant, like watching a scene from someone else's life. That distance was freedom. His name continued to fade from places where it had once commanded attention. Not erased entirely. History doesn't vanish that cleanly, but contextualized. Qualified. Referenced cautiously, if at all. Influence doesn't die in one blow. It bleeds out. He learned, too late, that fear-based power requires constant reinforcement. Once people stop being afraid, there's nothing left to sustain it. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I didn't monitor it closely. I trusted gravity. Systems, once engaged, do not need supervision. I had done my part simply by refusing to disappear quietly. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the city lights flickered on, I stood by my window and felt something I hadn't expected. Gratitude, not for what happened, but for what didn't. I was grateful that the room had cameras. Grateful that someone spoke up. Grateful that the bodyguard refused to continue. Grateful that I had survived long enough to see the truth unfold in full daylight. Most of all, I was grateful that I had not internalized his version of power. Because power that requires cruelty is already collapsing. I went to bed that night without replaying the past. I slept without bracing for the next explosion. In my dreams, there were no boardrooms, no commands, no raised hands. Just space. And in that space, I began to understand something fundamental. The opposite of power isn't weakness. It's peace. The truth has a strange way of settling into a room long after the noise is gone. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't argue. It simply exists, unmovable, waiting for everyone else to catch up. In the weeks that followed, more details surfaced, not because I pushed for them, but because silence had finally been broken. People who had been in that boardroom began to speak privately, then formally. They described what they had seen with the same words, the same pauses, the same visible discomfort. Their stories matched because they didn't need embellishment. He had ordered it. They had witnessed it. The system had recorded it. There was no ambiguity left to debate. What surprised many of them later was not that he had done it, but that he had believed he could. That assumption revealed more about him than any single act. He had mistaken obedience for loyalty, fear for respect, and silence for consent. When those illusions collapsed, there was nothing underneath to hold him up. I was asked more than once how I wanted to proceed. Each time, the choice was presented carefully, respectfully. I was not rushed. I was not pressured. For the first time in a long while, my autonomy was not treated as an inconvenience. I chose accountability, not spectacle. That decision confused some people. They expected fury. They expected revenge. What they didn't understand was that I had already experienced the worst moment. Everything after that was just process. I didn't need drama to validate what had happened. The facts did that on their own. As proceedings advanced, his attempts to reframe the narrative grew more desperate. He spoke of stress, of betrayal, of being provoked. Each explanation collapsed under the same weight. None of them explained why humiliation had felt acceptable to him. None of them justified why he believed he could turn a human being into entertainment. People stopped listening. That was the most devastating consequence of all. When someone loses credibility, even their apologies sound strategic. Even their regret feels conditional. He learned that lesson the hard way. Watching his statements he crafted carefully were met with silence or polite acknowledgement, and nothing more. I learned a different lesson. I learned that clarity does not require volume, that dignity does not require dominance, and that the strongest position is often the one that refuses to participate in the performance at all. Life began to take on a rhythm again. Ordinary, steady, unremarkable in the best way. I returned to routines that had nothing to do with him. Work that felt meaningful. Conversations that didn't feel like negotiations. Relationships that didn't require vigilance. Occasionally, someone would ask if I regretted not speaking up sooner, not leaving earlier. I answered honestly. Regret implies knowledge I didn't have at the time. What I had instead was endurance. And endurance kept me alive until clarity arrived. That clarity changed everything. When I thought back to the boardroom now, the image that stayed with me wasn't the slaps or the command. It was the moment the screen lit up. The moment power realized it had been observed. That moment marked the end of his authority and the beginning of my freedom. I didn't walk away because he fell. He fell because I refused to disappear. Power leaves residue. Even after titles are removed and accounts are frozen, the habits remain. The instinct to command. The expectation of deference. The belief that attention will eventually return. He lived with that residue every day. Without the structure that had once reinforced his authority, he drifted. Meetings were replaced by waiting rooms. Assistants were replaced by automated responses. Decisions were replaced by delays. Each small inconvenience felt like an insult because he had never learned how to exist without control. The world no longer adjusted itself around him. He tried to rebuild selectively, reaching out to people he believed might still answer. Some did cautiously, but conversations ended quickly. Opportunities evaporated once his name surfaced. His past followed him into every room now, not as admiration, but as warning. He had become a liability. That identity shift broke something in him that money never could. Without an audience, without leverage, without fear to lean on, he didn't know who he was. Power had been his personality. Without it, there was nothing left to perform. I felt none of that loss personally. His unraveling no longer intersected with my life. That separation was intentional. I had learned that healing does not require proximity to the wound. It requires distance and time. What remained for me was perspective. I began to understand how easily systems protect harm when silence is rewarded. How often cruelty survives not because it is hidden, but because it is tolerated. That realization sharpened my sense of responsibility, not to fix everything, but to never again participate in erasure. I spoke when it mattered. I withdrew when it didn't. I protected my peace with the same intensity one once spent protecting his reputation. The irony was not lost on me. Friends sometimes told me I seemed different, lighter, more decisive. I agreed. Trauma had not hardened me. It had clarified me. I no longer mistook chaos for passion or control for competence. I had seen the cost of that confusion up close. When I imagined my future now, it wasn't framed around escape or recovery. It was framed around presence, around choosing environments where accountability existed naturally, not as an afterthought, where respect didn't need to be enforced. I didn't need to rebuild an empire. I needed to rebuild myself. And that work, quiet and steady, felt more powerful than anything he had ever commanded. He thought the end would come loudly, a final confrontation, a negotiated settlement, a moment where he could reclaim some dignity through explanation or apology. It didn't. The end came quietly in the form of indifference. Phone stopped ringing. Invitations stopped arriving. His name stopped being useful. And when power can no longer extract attention, it dissolves completely. There was no villain's exit, no redemption arc, just absence. For me, the ending felt different. It felt earned. I stood one evening in my living room, the city humming softly outside, and realized I no longer measured time by before and after. The boardroom had become a reference point, not a residence. A memory, not a wound. I had crossed something irreversible. I understood now that dignity is not something given back after humiliation. It is something reclaimed by refusing to accept the terms of abuse in the first place. That reclamation had changed how I saw everything: relationships, power, silence, myself. If there is one truth the entire ordeal left me with, it is this: power that relies on cruelty is already collapsing. Silence that protects harm is never neutral. And survival, when honored, becomes authority no one can take away. He ordered 30 slaps because he believed humiliation would prove his dominance. 30 minutes later, his career and fortune crumbled because truth does not negotiate with arrogance. And I walked away not because he begged, but because I no longer needed him to understand. He thought power meant ordering pain. He thought silence meant obedience. He thought humiliation would make him untouchable. But real power doesn't shout. It doesn't strike. And it never needs an audience. He lost everything the moment he mistook cruelty for control. I gained everything the moment I refused to disappear. And that is the difference between someone who collapses and someone who walks away standing tall.